This is a video about well-being and the particular problems facing the legal profession. In the last 10 years or so, we've become acutely aware of the problems of mental illness, of suicide, depression, addiction, PTSD, anxiety and other disorders amongst members of the legal profession. And we're going to have a look at some of the surveys and some of the research that has been done in this field. Many of the issues discussed here, of course, are going to be relevant to the other justice professions, particularly people in law enforcement and corrections, but we don't have as reliable information or surveys done for people in that area. So we're going to really focus on the legal issues, but if you're from one of those other professions, bear with us because a lot of the same issues do apply. Now, this is the second go I've had at putting this video together, and the first version I used a series of very moody black and white sort of images to discuss the issue, and they were all very thematic and everything, but the overall effect I think was rather too negative. So the images I'm using this time round are a lot nicer on the eye and a lot more soothing. They have nothing at all to do with the material I'm discussing here, but I think it's important to try and balance out the light with the dark, and the information here is pretty bad, but we are also in a situation where we are able to turn things around and change things and improve. So I want to try and maintain some sense of balance here. So the core study I want to discuss is a study called Courting the Blues, Attitudes Towards Depression in Australian Law Students and Lawyers, which was conducted in 2009 by the Brain and Mind Research Institute of the University of Sydney. And this came in the wake of increasing awareness of these problems, and there was a survey done with 700 students from across 13 different universities, almost 1,000 solicitors and 750 barristers. So there was a wide range of people surveyed to understand their experience of things like anxiety and depression and their attitudes and the attitudes they've experienced in their workplace. The survey found that 50% of law students, a third of solicitors and a fifth of barristers had experienced depression somewhere in their careers. And beyond mere depression, there was statistics that showed that there were very high levels of distress amongst law students. So as a matter of comparison, people who've suffered very high levels of distress in the general population are only 3%. Amongst medical students, it's 5%, but amongst law students, it's a whopping 13%. So law students are more than four times more likely to experience very high levels of distress than ordinary members of society, and more than twice as more likely the medical students. And we tend to think of medical studies as being very high pressure. The same questions were asked of professionals, and again, the general percentage of people who face very high distress in society is around 4%. But amongst barristers, it's about the same. It's 4.2%. So that's interesting that barristers don't suffer as much, but solicitors, it's 8.7%. So in profession, it's not just law students. In professional life, solicitors report suffering very high levels of distress, and these stats are similar through all the different other levels of distress that people reported, from mild through to very high. So the Courting the Blues research exposed something which is, at that point, we were only just beginning to understand and was generally not acknowledged, was that there are very, very high levels both of mental illness and of distress amongst lawyers and law students. They also reported very high rates of reluctance to seek help, usually due to social stigma and a perception that they would be seen as weak if they asked for help. And this is how I guess we end up with problems escalating into things like addiction and suicide, where people are not obtaining the help that they need. So is there something, different about law students? There was some research done asking this question in the United States, and they surveyed students before they started legal training And they actually found that people who were planning to study law but had not yet commenced, or who were studying pre-law under the US system, had higher rates of life satisfaction and well-being than other students. But very, very quickly there was a rapid decline in well-being. And they found that very soon into their law studies, students reported symptoms of obsessive compulsiveness, interpersonal sensitivity, paranoid ideation, hostility, depression, anxiety, and loss of subjective well-being once law school began. These symptoms worsened through the students' candidatures and were still present once they graduated. So this is a very sobering statistic to consider, and admittedly it's a United States statistic, and there are much higher levels of debt associated with law study there. But nevertheless, it's something we need to think about, that it's not an issue that people who are predisposed to issues with well-being are attracted to law. It seems to be that there is something about the process of legal training that leads to a rapid decline in well-being. And therefore, this is a responsibility for law schools, and it's a responsibility for the communities around law schools. So this video is I guess, the start of the conversation, particularly for those of you who are going on to study in a law degree. And it's the start of a process of unpicking some of these issues and trying to understand them. Now, there have been later surveys, but unfortunately the results have not improved. There was a Meritus survey in 2019 that found 85% of lawyers experienced anxiety at work and 60% had experienced depression along the way. So, if anything, the rates of mental illness seem to be increasing, but this might also mean that the rates of reporting are increasing as the issue has become less of a stigma. So we need to be careful about seeing this as just an epidemic of mental illness. It may be that a lot of people who previously did not acknowledge the issues may be acknowledging them more now. So it may actually be, in some ways, part of a positive movement. But nevertheless, these rates are extremely high and are not sustainable for a profession. And as we've no doubt discussed with you elsewhere, you know, the legal profession is shrinking, and the career opportunities for law graduates are wide and diverse, but are increasingly moving away from the legal profession itself. And these are all going to be factors there. The perceived and actual toxicity of legal workplaces have got to be a reason why people are taking other opportunities, more rewarding opportunities in safer work environments. So what is it about a law workplace that creates these sort of problems? And remember, of course, that data seems to suggest that it's the students who start suffering before they start working. So it's not necessarily the fact that it's the workplaces, it's the way in which they are prepared, I guess, as well as the workplaces. So there have been a few different reasons suggested. We don't know for sure. The most common one, of course, is that the type of work that lawyers do is high pressure, involves very significant issues for clients, and is therefore naturally somehow more stressful. The problem with this argument is, of course, that the rates are much higher, much worse than medical professionals. And while it is actually quite, a significant amount of pressure to be responsible for someone's life or liberty or to represent them in the law, it honestly can't be as severe as telling someone that they have cancer and they're going to die. So medical work, you would think, under this argument, if we're saying it's just about high pressure, stressful work, you would think that the medical profession would be showing much higher rates than law. And in fact, while they're not great, the medicine is significantly lower. So it's not just about the type of work, obviously. A lot of it may be about the conditions in the workplace. Again, we'll have to take this with a grain of salt, because of the conditions in medical workplaces aren't great either. But working long hours under demanding conditions has got to add stress. Bullying is widespread in the legal profession, and toxic workplaces are reported in not everywhere, but are quite prevalent. So there is something about and we'll come back to this idea, the culture of legal workplaces that needs to change. There is also a sense in which lawyers exist in closed networks, and this comes around, of course, when you have long work hours and no time to socialise and no time for family and no time for all those other issues, that you end up in this kind of closed network of the only people you talk to are people in the same situations, which means you can entrench dissatisfaction because everyone's facing the same sort of problems in the workplace, but it also means you can lose a sense of perspective because everyone that you know is someone who's also in this sort of unusual bubble. So some of the solutions that we're thinking about is trying to make sure that lawyers maintain a better sets of open networks and are more exposed to life-work balance across all of society. Other issues that have been proposed as reasons for the high rates of mental illness, the focus on billable hours in the legal profession. It's certainly not a rewarding way to work, and we'll talk about this in other parts of the law degree, but the idea that you're responsible to try and work to a schedule of hours and to extract as much money from clients in those hours is not the sort of pressure that most professionals work under, and leads to high levels of dissatisfaction, and of course is the cause for a lot of the bullying and toxic cultures that can exist. Another reason is the pessimism that lawyers are exposed to the very worst of human behaviour and human attitudes. And this is, I think, a good one that might explain the difference between lawyers and doctors, because the enemies that doctors face are diseases and illness and injury, whereas with lawyers we face people's weaknesses, people's vulnerabilities, people's vices. We see the worst that humans have to provide. So I think there is a good sense in which the nature of work is not that it's hard or that the hours are long, but that you just deal with really awful people and really awful conflicts a lot of the time, and that's not a very rewarding way to work. We've also mentioned the stigmatisation of mental illness. People are reluctant to seek help, particularly in environments where it's perceived that your career progression depends on working unreasonably long hours, working unpaid overtime, working across weekends. And this culture of overwork is one that leads to burnout, and particularly people are reluctant to then seek help or admit that they can't actually cope with these unreasonable workloads, and quite often ends up with people leaving the profession altogether, or suffering from the workplace stresses. Another issue that is less common than it used to be in the law but is still prevalent is working with managers who don't have foundational knowledge or skills around management or staff wellbeing. So your traditional manager of a law firm was a lawyer who came out of law school with no training in managing people or understanding people or managing illness and well-being, and they just replicated the model of work that they themselves were inducted into. That's changing as the average law firm is starting to disappear, the old style law firm is starting to disappear, and we're starting to see more of the big corporate firms which will have HR departments, will hire professional managers, and will seek people who have actual management skills to run it, not just the most senior lawyer. So the legal profession is quite in flux at the moment, but there is still the overhang from the old feudal models where basically you were brought into a firm as an article clerk. You worked for very little money extremely hard in the hope that you would then get a job as a lawyer, and then as a junior lawyer you worked really, really hard in the hope you'd become a partner, and so on and so forth. And by the time I guess you became a senior partner, you had lived your whole life without life-work balance, and you didn't really know any different from this culture of overwork. So more professional law firms have the potential to create environments that are more, while hardly stress-free, are more like typical corporate work environments where people are more concerned about occupational health and safety and more worried that they may get sued for breaches of duty of care to the employees. So what do we do about these problems? And I certainly don't want to leave you after this video with an idea that the legal profession is terrible and that you don't want anything to do with it, and that nothing is ever going to change. Because the legal profession is changing. It's changing very dramatically and very quickly. But it's important that we go into this career with our eyes open. Now, there's an organisation called the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation that was created after the unfortunate suicide of a young lawyer. And they created a set of workplace wellbeing guidelines that you can sign up to, or that organisations can sign up to. So if you are interested in these, have a look at the Tristan Jepson Memorial Foundation website. And a large number of firms and universities have signed up to these guidelines and plans to implement change. Now, we're not sure how effective these have been and how much this is lip service to people, wanting to show they're providing better workplaces, but at least there's a framework here for changes. And a lot of the changes are about changing those workplace cultures, providing better leadership and better management of workloads, providing work cultures that are based on civility and respect, not working people as hard as you like on the basis that, well, back when I was a young lawyer, I got worked very hard, therefore these people have to do the same. It also focuses on providing protection and support mechanisms where people can get help where they need to provide education to try and stop levels of stigmatisation around mental health, and to provide frameworks for thinking about life-work balance so that people don't burn out and that people have other things outside their career to provide that sense of equilibrium and balance in their lives. So there are also educational aspects that come out of this quite obviously, and the development of coping skills need to be part of the legal education and part of the professional development that lawyers get going forward. And this is not just a question of developing the skills in yourself, but also developing the skills to help and manage other people and to perceive issues and understand them. So I mentioned previously that the law is changing, that the law business model is changing, and this has some good and some bad factors. As I mentioned a little while ago, the idea of a more professionalised, more corporate law firm is a relief from some of the entrenched toxic cultures that have existed under the old overwork concept. It's no protection against it, absolutely, but if you actually have an HR department you can report bullies to, that's got to be a big improvement than just hoping that someone in the partners in the firm will pay attention to what's going on with the mistreatment of junior staff. But there are aspects of these new models which are also not as good. There's been a move towards precarious employment, where people no longer have ongoing employment, they have short-term contracts. And that's going to make work life more stressful just out of its very nature. Also, we're moving towards international outsourcing of work out of law firms, and a lot of the introductory work that young lawyers gained experience from is now being outsourced internationally, where it's much cheaper, of course, but for the whole profession that means that there is a much more difficult chain of entry into the profession for young lawyers, and there isn't the ability to get that basic experience and to get those basic skills they need once they start. So these are issues that are big ongoing challenges for the legal profession, and part of the ongoing challenge to provide a safer and better workplace for everyone where wellbeing is protected. Now, in terms of the message to you as a student, and I'm addressing, of course, law students, justice students, criminology students here, the most important thing you can do is to be aware. All right, is to be aware of these issues and to know and to take any opportunity you can to learn more about the issues, and in doing so to be able to look after yourself and also to look after your colleagues. So rather than necessarily saying it's all the responsibility of organisations to protect the people who work within them, and of course it is, I'm not saying that it isn't, but we can be much more effective as individuals in intervening, in seeking help when we need to, and also asking people when they need help, and not judging, not stigmatising, and having an open mind about all these issues.